Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Cristina Talens, and I'm the Director of Modern Slavery Risk Assessments at the Wilberforce Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar at the Wilberforce Business Academy. So in today's presentation, I'm going to be looking at how businesses create transparency and how they are working towards mapping their supply chains, and also considering how that fits into the due diligence frameworks around labor and human rights. So I will be looking at how we are implementing this requirement within companies and thinking about the potential implications also for companies and the way that they work with suppliers. So with that in mind, over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be covering off some of the key provisions of due diligence and transparency and looking at what companies are already doing in this area. I would like to point out that this Zoom session is being recorded, but we will stop the recording when we come to questions at the end. And during my presentation, you're all very welcome to send in your questions. There's a little chat box at the bottom of your screen. And then we can cover those off later. So I think towards the end, it will leave us with about 15 minutes at the end of the session to just go through any questions that you might have, or just have a discussion about how you're addressing issues. And given that we've got a few people here today, if I can't answer all of the questions or we can't get through all of the questions, you're very welcome to send those questions in via email and I will get back to you. Okay, so without further ado, let me share my presentation. So yes, this is the third webinar that we've had at the Wilberforce Business Academy, and we really wanted to create a special session around how you create transparency and how you map supply chains, because I think it's probably one of the most complex areas and one of the areas where most businesses have the most questions. For those that don't know us at the Wilberforce Institute, we are a world-leading research center. We are actually part of the University of Hull. We were founded in 2006, and we have a really multidisciplinary team with staff that work on history, law, social sciences, and education. I'm not actually an academic, I'm a practitioner, so I spend a lot of my time in the field working with businesses or conducting risk assessments. All of the team that works with me on due diligence and labor and human rights have direct experience of dealing with forced labor, debt bondage, trafficking and smuggling in supply chains. Our risk assessment services were actually set up back in 2014 to try to create almost a support structure for businesses in order for them to be able to deal with the Modern Slavery Act. And that was the legislation that came in 2015. My own background is, well, I'm director of the risk assessment services here at the Wilberforce Institute. I was an international business student, but very soon after finishing that degree, I came out and started working with Anti-Slavery International, and I worked with them in France, Spain, and Italy. I have worked for a very big commodities companies. I've worked inside a buying department with other commodities buyers, but I was ethical trade manager and trained as a social auditor, which means I get sent into, I specialize a lot in agriculture, but I get sent into sites to look at how companies are addressing labor and human rights risks. And we look at key provisions around minimum age, living wage, discrimination, health and safety, casualization of labor. So those are the kind of things that we are checking as social auditors. I was also a consultant for the UN Global Program Against Trafficking and Smuggling of Human Beings. So I was involved in a lot of big cooperation projects between origin and destination countries and host countries for victims of trafficking. And this was back in 2000. And I've had a lot of experience of working with the Ethical Trading Initiative. That's a tripartite organization that's based in London, and they have NGOs, businesses and trade unions that sit around the table to look at how they can monitor labor conditions in supply chains worldwide. And altogether, we're looking at about £107 billion worth of business that is represented at the ETI. So why focus on transparency and mapping? The first thing is that it may actually be a legal requirement for your company to report on your supply chains. Now, there is the Modern Slavery Act, which makes it a provision that for companies with over £36 million turnover, they have to publicly report on what they're doing in their direct operations and in their supply chains. We now have EU due diligence law that came about in November 2022, and then has been passed as a framework in 2023. This very week, actually, it's being enacted as legislation. So for companies that are dealing with the EU or that are accessing EU markets, I think it's going to be essential that they are working on due diligence, transparency, mapping, and addressing labor and human rights risks. Secondly, to develop labor and human rights due diligence, you actually need to identify where you have risks. And that brings us to the third point, which means that you have to actively identify and manage your suppliers when it comes to risks. It means that you have to have that traceability further down the supply chains. Also, by monitoring what is going on in your supply chain, you actually set a benchmark for suppliers to adhere to a set of standards, and that gives you a little bit more stability in terms of continuous supply. So you develop those relationships as you go along. And finally, and the most obvious one, is that you probably need to avoid reputational risks to your company. So if you know what the risks are, you can actually do something about them. The objectives for today are going to be, it's a whistle-stop tour, but first of all, it's to help you understand what is meant by due diligence. Secondly, look at the best practice when it comes to mapping the supply chain, and I will just base that on what we have done at the Wilberforce Institute and how we've worked with companies. Thirdly, want to consider how businesses develop transparency on labor, human rights, and I've included environmental human risks because this is part of the EU due diligence law. And then finally, we'll cover off any questions at the end that you might have on best practice. So what is due diligence in labor and human rights? The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is a framework that is being implemented by lots of larger companies around the world. And the retailers, for example, that I work with in the UK, most of them are implementing this framework. They define due diligence as the action taken by a company to both identify and act upon actual and potential risks for workers in its operations, supply chains, and the services it uses. We have something like this with the Modern Slavery Act and the Transparency in Supply Chain Clause. This particular sentence captures what is being enacted across all the legislation in the EU. The due diligence framework has a four-step approach. The first one of these is that all companies must assess actual and potential human rights risks. So you have to understand what the country risks are in the countries where you source your products or where you are actually operating. You have to be able to map the supply chains. You have to identify what risks exist for your sector, your industry, or your region, and the kind of people that are affected by those risks. Look at direct and indirect causes and impacts. So, for example, a direct cause might be, poor regulation on a country level. And an indirect cause might be something to do with your purchasing practices and the way that you are purchasing from those suppliers. Reviewing of HR system, assessing workers' ability to access rights to freedom of association, and ranking risks by severity and the degree of responsibility. All of these are this is the kind of information that we are talking about when we're looking at the first part of assessing actual and potential human rights risks. Finally, when you've analyzed this data, you should be in a position to then do something about that. And that leads us to the second part of the framework, which is identifying, leveraging, taking responsibility for whatever impact you're having, and then the actions that you're going to put into place. The third part of the framework is that you need to then mitigate the risk and remediate on any issues that have been brought up by workers. And finally, when you've got all those reports and all that information in, you would be monitoring, reviewing, reporting, and then looking at how you're going to improve the situation. Okay, so in terms of the due diligence law, I've said that it's been picked up already in the UK Modern Slavery Act through the Transparency in Supply Chains. So that is Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act. The EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is the piece of legislation that I was saying that is being adopted at an EU level. And then we've already got labour and human rights legislation in Germany, France, Holland, the US, Australia, and New Zealand. And all of those pieces of legislation are following the same framework for due diligence. So it makes things a little bit easier, makes it a level playing field. When we talk about transparency and looking at the risks in supply chain, you have to really at some point consider who is at risk in your supply chains and how. So we tend to focus a lot on vulnerable and low-skilled workers in supply chains. Any sectors where there's an incidence of child labor, where there are reports, national reports, and a very good source of information is the Department for Labor in the US. Any cases where there are indigenous peoples with poor protection from the state. And again, we mentioned environment before, but that really has to do with land rights as well, and the way that resources are being used in the areas where indigenous peoples live. The material source from high conflict areas, and you'd seen there earlier that there was a picture from the cobalt mines in the DRC. Anything like that is something that you would have to consider. Migrant workers with poor language skills is something that we would look at in the UK and Europe, all around. Any sectors, for example, the construction sector or the facilities management sector, where you've got subcontractors and agency workers, because of the short-term impact of the labor, and also because it's such insecure labor conditions that it puts them at greater risk. And then countries with poor human rights records. You would probably have to report on all of these different workers that are affected. So when we say, when we need to target those areas that we are going to map, the first thing that I would say is that you have to look at your direct operations, your services and logistics. So if you are a facilities management firm, a food production facility, you may be dependent on agency workers. You may have subcontractors for cleaning or construction, maintenance, catering, plumbing, logistics, warehousing. All of those suppliers of services need to come into your mapping exercise. Then we tend to identify core and strategic suppliers based on volume and value. So depending on the size of your business, you may or may not have a lot of leverage. So it makes it very difficult when you want to engage suppliers or you want to do a risk assessment of a supplier to actually be able to go in there and do anything about it. There is more onus being put on sectors creating their own collaborative organizations to allow companies to have that leverage. And then you need to understand the supply chain and the risk for your products and services. So this is just, so this is how we map the supply chains. So we look, I've taken an example of a poultry farm. So we would look at everything that's involved in the production of that hen or that chicken at the end. So you've got here a whole supply chain looking at the supply chain from the moment when the chicks are grown to the farms, to the breeding farms, to the hatcheries, to the broiler farms, to the processing units, and to the distribution of that product at the end. We've also included the feed mill because there are sometimes, so this is a second tier supply, and this is to give you an example of what a second tier would look at like. So all of those different suppliers are dependent on a second tier of services being supplied into them. And here we've given the example of the feed mill. Okay, so they are a supplier to the pullet farm. So the first thing that we would look at is, creating a ranking based on the level of spend on suppliers. So we will typically go into a procurement team and say, can you give us a list of all of your suppliers and organize them based on spend? And that within that, we will also have the suppliers based on the sector of activity or the services that they're supplying into the company. The second thing that we would say is, when it comes to mapping your supply chains, another very useful thing to do is to look at branded items or services which are crucial to your businesses. So anything that carries your name in the delivery of, whether it's a product or a service, we would say is a crucial supplier to your business, because they effectively represent you, even if they are outsourced or subcontracted. Thirdly, we would filter those strategic suppliers, because sometimes when you come to looking at supply chains, you might end up with thousands of suppliers, and you have to find some way of consolidating that data. So we tend to say, let's focus on the first 50% of top spending suppliers, or suppliers with whom we've got a spend of over 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 pounds, depending on the size of the business. So those are the suppliers that I would say are strategic suppliers. And then fourthly, if you are sourcing from other countries, or your suppliers are sourcing from other countries, that's a fourth filter that we would have there to identify risks elsewhere beyond the UK. And this is where we tend to say that we need to gather data to tier 2 and 3. So as in the example that I've given you earlier of the feeding mill, what we need to do at each stage is look at the product ID. So create a product ID that matches up across all of your systems. Obviously, give it the product name as an identifier, the supplier name as an identifier, and then contact email addresses, product component, whatever it is that they supply into you, the country of origin where they're based. They might all be in the UK, but when you are going out to see your suppliers, you might ask them to then break that down to a second tier and a third tier. So you start getting more of that data coming in. Look at the spend per product, and then look at whether it's a strategic supplier. And this should really allow you to start thinking about who you're going to engage first in terms of driving labor and human rights, or who you're going to cover off in your research. Fourthly, so let's say you end up with 1,000 or 2,000 suppliers. I mean, we have had sometimes 90,000 product lines to look through. So, you can have quite a lot of suppliers. One of the most effective ways that we have to actually bring in the data and look at risks in supply chains is to do a desk review. So if you have thousands of suppliers that are on that list, we would then look at the name of the supplier, the location where that supplier is based, and we would look at the industry, the risk of that sector or that industry in whatever country or region that supplier is based. So we give a weighting system to risk. We would say that if your supplier, and it's just a Google search, obviously looking at labor and human rights information on that supplier and that product in that region, we would look at the supplier's name. If the supplier is mentioned in some sort of labor issues, let's say there's been an accident or a death on the site, or let's say there has been strike action from workers on the site of use where that supplier is named, we would give that a weight rating of 3 points. If there is a high risk of labor or human rights risk, so it could be child labor, it could be indigenous peoples, it could be discrimination of women, sexual harassment in the sector. It could, it could be any series of issues, but we would give it 1 point also for the location, and then 1 point if your industry has been named in those kind of risks. And this then starts to give us a little bit of a picture about where we have risks in the supply chain. The fifth thing that we would do, once we've done that desk review, and we extract all that data, we then identify, perhaps 10, 20 suppliers, which we are going to directly visit to conduct a risk assessment. And this is where the social audit skills come in. So we will go into the site, we will interview management. It's usually more management that we are going to interview to see how they organize their labor force and how they manage their workers. And these are some of the areas where we have found risks in the past, and this was with regards to facilities management. So the risks would be different depending on the sector that you're operating in. But we found here, for example, that there was no trade union representation or no alternative worker committee or voice to be able to bring up complaints. The sites had never been checked or audited. There was very poor knowledge of industry risks, so the suppliers didn't know what their own risks, labor and human rights risks were in their sector. Sometimes there's no policies and procedures, there are informal working arrangements. And even in the UK, a verbal contract is actually legal. So you can imagine, the further afield that you go as well, you will be finding, and the sector that you're operating in, it's not uncommon to find, quite informal labor structures in place. No written terms and condition, poor recording of hours. They're just some examples that we would give you of where the risks could be. And then we'd say, this is the prevalence of that issue in your industry. This is how important a risk it is for your supply chain. And that's really it. It's it feels relatively straightforward. I think the main issue with the mapping of the supply chain and creating transparency is that there's a lot of work involved in actually doing the research and engaging suppliers to actually map your supply chains to tier 2 and tier 3. Those, I would say, are the most tricky parts of the process when it comes to the due diligence aspect. In terms of steps for any business that's beginning to work on this, I would definitely say map your supply chains based on spend. So again, no legislation is asking any company to address labor and human rights risks overnight. What they want to see the company doing is that they are continuously improving and continuously working in this area. And this is very clear from all the legislative pieces that I've read. So start with your top suppliers and work your way down. Then secondly, I would say contact your first tier suppliers and then develop the traceability into the second and third tier of those supply chains. Again, you'll see that, things start to become more granular and you start to get a real feel for the product and the areas where you've got risks in whatever it is that you're doing. Thirdly, and this is a very good way to go about it, if you've got hundreds and, thousands of suppliers, conduct a desk review to identify the risks. It's probably the most effective way for any company to get a top line picture of what's going on in the sector and in the country. Fourthly, gather intelligence on the country, the sector, specific risks, the workers that are affected, the communities, anywhere where your company is impacting on those working and living conditions further down the line is something that you need to start to think about addressing. And again, not only in terms of labor and human rights, but also in terms of environmental risk, because an environmental risk also poses a danger to local communities where products are sourced. So it is automatically captured in the EU due diligence legislation. And then finally, conduct on-site risk assessments and use those findings to help you decide how you're going to support your suppliers going forward, where they might need support in terms of policies, procedures, what kind of advice you can give them about managing the risks.